Hello everybody and welcome back to Rev Left Radio. On today's episode we have back on the show Aaron Leonard to talk about his newest book, Whole World in an Uproar, Music, Rebellion, and Repression from 1955 to 1972. So as always, Aaron is a wonderful sort of, articulator of American history, and while he's ostensibly writing a book about music in this period of time, he's always connecting it with deeper political, social, and economic issues and showing how they are, in an utter dialectical relationship with the cultural products that our society produces. And this is a wonderful addition to his growing library of books that he's written. We've had him on to talk about heavy radicals. We've had him on to talk about the folk singers in the Bureau, on to talk about Judas and the Black Messiah, the documentary a year or two ago about Fred Hampton, COINTELPRO. We've had him on many times, and he's always a pleasure. I always learn something new from him. He's definitely one of my favorite guests, and this episode is going to be wonderful because not only are we going to be talking about the book, we are also going to be playing music from the artists and the bands that he mentions throughout the episode. And for those that might not know, or for those that enjoy Rev Left and like what we do here, it really means a lot to us if you could go to patreon.com/Rev Left Radio. And for basically the cost of a cup of coffee a month, you can support the show and get access to 3 bonus episodes a month. And on the Patreon, I do different things than I do on the main feed. I try to cover more topics in the news headlines. I do readings. I field questions, etc. So if you like the show, you want to support it, and you want to get bonus content, go over to patreon.com/Rev Left Radio. We deeply, deeply appreciated it. All right, so without further ado, here is my conversation with Aaron J. Leonard on his new book, Whole World in an Uproar, Music, Rebellion, and Repression, 1955 to 1972. Enjoy.
So I am Aaron Leonard. I'm an author living out in sunny Los Angeles. I've written several books, mainly dealing with governmental repression and radicalism, but I've kind of extended that out into a more societal repression and systemic forces.
Yeah, absolutely. And longtime Rev Left listeners will be familiar with you. You've been on the show many times. Every time you release a book, I am eager to have you back on the show to talk about it. And today we're talking about your newest book, Whole World in an Uproar, Music, Rebellion, and Repression from 1955 through 1972. So first and foremost, Aaron, can you talk about the book, kind of what it's about and why you wanted to write it?
Yeah, I've been wanting to write this book for some time. I had hoped it would be a book similar to my previous one, The Folk Singers in the Bureau, which was, mainly based on a lot of FBI files being released. But with this book, the challenge was a lot of the artists, people like Sam Cooke or Nina Simone, and others, didn't have extensive FBI files, or the Bureau said those files had existed, but they'd been destroyed. So I needed to try to sort out, was there a kind of a embedded repression aimed at people doing music that challenged the status quo that wasn't always coming from the FBI? So that's how the book evolved. So it does base itself on a fair amount of FBI documentations, people like Phil Ochs and Miriam Makeba. Even I've got some things on Bob Dylan, but with others like the Grateful Dead or the Doors or Jefferson Airplane, you have to look more toward these overall governmental forces or the media, the pundocracy, etc. So that's kind of how that book evolved. But I think the other thing is I wanted to write a book about the 60s that took a different skew than most conventional writing on it does. A lot of the argumentation on the 60s, well, there was this good period. You had JFK, you had Martin Luther King, you had civil rights, and it was all, making advances. And then, Kennedy got killed and, King was assassinated, and it all descended into violence. And it was, it's the 60s is a series of assassinations and disenchantment. I knew that wasn't true. It was a lot more complicated than that. Yes, these assassinations had profound impacts, but in fact, the world as a whole was in some pretty sharp transition between 1956 and 1972. And to understand that, you got to look at the bigger geopolitical framework and, the contending ideologies of, this socialism, communism, in the Soviet Union and China, and the United States, which is the biggest power in the world coming off of World War II. So what was going on in there that led to this societal tumult, uprisings in, among the Black nation, as some people refer to it, the Black population, as others do, this huge anti-war movement and resistance against the war, refusing to fight and die for the United States, and this cultural counterculture ferment in which people rejected the consumerism of American society, which was supposed to be the panacea and the quintessence of living. All of these things sprung out amid major geopolitical shifts. So it's a long way to get it. I wanted to write a book about the 60s, and I wanted it to be steeped particularly in these cultural forces who had such a profound and enlivening effect. So that's somewhat how I decided to take this on.
Yeah, and I think you definitely succeeded at that. I love that it's ostensibly and on the surface about the music and the artistic output, cultural output of that time, but because it's going to be tethered to the deeper historical, political, economic situations that are happening, and then that is reflected in the culture and the music. And so you're studying both kind of at the same time and tracing their connections, which I love. Now, this is also, as you say in the book, the period of time when you were coming of age. So is it even more personal than perhaps the folk singer book or other books that, I guess your Heavy Radicals was personal because you were involved directly in that as well. But just as you coming of age in this time, is it sort of a nostalgic period for you? How do you think back on it personally?
Yeah, well, no, I appreciate the question. I was just a little kid in 1968. I was 11 years old. I was a Boy Scout, for crying out loud. I was working my way up. I was going to be an Eagle Scout, and we landed on the moon in 1969. I was at Boy Scout camp. So I lived in one world, but then culturally, I was, I wanted to be cool because that's, when you're 11, 12, 13, you want to be cool. And all the cool stuff was like Jefferson Airplane and Grateful Dead and the Doors, and a bunch of music I would discover later. So, yeah, I experienced, I watched the 1968 Democratic Convention with my parents, and it kind of turned my head around watching young people, these people I looked up to, getting the crap beat out of them by the Chicago police. And it vaulted me in a different direction. Within a few years, I was just on the whole other side of the divide. And I think this was true for a lot of people. I'm kind of a younger person. I mean, boomers kind of get cut into two sectors: early boomers right after World War II, and then the later ones, more in the late 50s, and that's kind of where I came in. So yeah, a lot of it was familiar, but it was looking back on it. Actually, the first 45 I ever bought was The Fifth Dimension, Let the Sunshine In, The Age of Aquarius, right, which was a pop version from the musical Hair, but the musical Hair is like really radical. Joseph Papp, who back in the 50s had been called in front of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. Joseph Papp, who started Shakespeare in the Park in New York, he's the guy who was a real important catalyst to bringing Hair to Broadway, which was very controversial at the time. So you can see how this counterculture is weaving into the mainstream. The Fifth Dimension, I give them props for what they are, but they were definitely pitched toward a much wider audience than hippies in San Francisco. Hippies themselves, by the time I was in high school, nobody called it. you weren't calling yourself a hippie. I think I might have mentioned this to you in previous conversation. You called yourself freaks as a kind of embracing, you know, a disparaging label. You know, freaks not fitting into the main of society. So yeah, it was very familiar, but it's like anything. You look back on it and you realize, oh, it was a lot different than what I thought. I was so much in the middle of it that it's impossible to understand. Any individual in the middle of something can't understand the wider import of things. You need to step out of it.
Yeah, definitely.
People are strange when you're a stranger. Faces look ugly when you're alone. Women seem wicked when you're unwanted. Streets are uneven when you're down. When you're strange, faces come out of the rain. When you're strange, no one remembers your name. When you're strange, when you're strange, when you're strange. People are strange when you're a stranger. Faces look ugly when you're alone. Women seem wicked when you're unwanted. Streets are uneven when you're down. When you're strange, faces come out of the rain. When you're strange, no one remembers your name. When you're strange, when you're strange, when you're strange. All right, yeah. When you're strange, faces come out of the rain. When you're strange, no one remembers your name. When you're strange, when you're strange, when you're strange.
Well, the book covers the period from 1955 to 1972, as I said, and as we were alluding to, it's an incredible and often tragic transitionary time in American history, rife with war, political assassinations, cultural revolutions, and more. Since this story begins in the 50s, though, can you discuss the cultural dynamics at that time with the new and emerging youth culture after World War II, the invention of rock and roll, the beatniks, and sort of how it was all received by the dominant and much more conformist mainstream culture?
Yeah, it was interesting to me because, the 50s is, to the degree people understand it, they think of, the old situation comedy Happy Days, or the film Grease, kind of a halcyonic, innocent time. But, Khrushchev gets up and denounces Stalin in 1956, and it causes a huge rift among, communists worldwide. It also signals, kind of the end of a certain type of the 50s. So, around 55, 56, you have this film, Blackboard Jungle, about juvenile delinquents. And it opens with Bill Haley and the Comets doing Rock Around the Clock. And kids are rioting, when they hear this song. And like the media is going crazy, like, oh, we can't show this movie a year later, because it's profitable. There's another movie, Rock Around the Clock, itself. And again, people are, marching in the streets, throwing rocks through windows, having little scuffles with police. I mean, it's like a moral panic. And, Rock Around the Clock, I mean, by 1971, it'll be inserted into American Graffiti as a kind of a calm down throwback song. But at the time, it's incendiary, and you've got Elvis, who plays a certain role, but you've got Little Richard, Eddie Cochran, Bo Diddley, Chuck Berry, all these great people doing this music that makes you want to move in ways that are not amenable to a Puritan aesthetic. And then, along with rock and roll, you've got some of these jazz artists like Max Roach, doing songs in support of the emerging Black freedom movement, which has kind of got going in 55 and 56 with the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott. So you've got the beat poets, people like Jack Kerouac, who love jazz, by the way, and it's all in on the road, and they're kind of challenging the post-war normalcy, the beat generation being, we're just a beat generation was Kerouac's thing. We're not the silent generation or this or that. We're just alienated, essentially. That gets bastardized by a columnist out in San Francisco who calls them beatniks, kind of disparaging them, and attaching them to the Sputnik, which had just gone up and kind of rattled the U.S. power structure. But the beats, they represented a thing for the intelligentsia, which was outside of the mainstream. And then you have this folk revival, where you've got people like Odetta and Carolyn Hester and the Kingston Trio doing this music that had been kind of a tethered to left-wing politics. I mean, and they're taking it mainstream. So you've got all these cultural forces circulating in the late 50s, and they're going to have a huge impact on the music to come. And this is the 50s. There's a lot more going on there than you would expect. And it makes sense, It's like a burning inferno doesn't just start all at once. It, most of the time.
You're right.
It percolates and gestates, and that was what was happening in the late 50s.
Yeah. When you said they were disparagingly called the beatniks, they referred to themselves as the Beats, and then they were called the beatniks because of the connection to Sputnik. But the Beats, as far as I understand it, weren't necessarily political, or certainly weren't communistic. What was the idea behind trying to tie them to Sputnik and the Soviets? Was it just they're bad, just like the Soviets are bad, or what?
Yeah, well, I mean, Jesus, they didn't seem defensive about homosexuality. They didn't seem defensive about, not living a conventional middle class lifestyle. They didn't seem defensive about just getting on the road and trying to live life to its fullest versus accumulating a lot of stuff. No, they're not. Although Allen Ginsberg, I think, actually is pretty political, and he is kind of at the center of a lot of the countercultural stuff that happens in the 60s. But no, I mean, as individuals, they're not particularly political people. But what they represent societally is, they're like kind of a sliver in the organism. And the organism is, rallying its resources to get rid of this thing that's causing it trouble. And that's kind of what I came to realize. It's not like you necessarily have to get up there and have a manifesto saying we need to eliminate private property to call forward the wrath of the ruling structure. There's this quote I have at the end. Spiro Agnew was Richard Nixon's vice president. He was like Nixon's point person in the cultural wars. And he gives this speech, I think around 1970 or so, where he says, "I do not suggest for one moment that there is a conspiracy among some songwriters, entertainers, and movie producers to subvert the unsuspecting listener. In my opinion, there isn't any. But the cumulative impact of some of their work advances the wrong cause." I just thought that was a really sharp articulation of how it actually goes. Some of these songs they put forward, they gave aid and comfort to the wrong cause, whether deliberately, consciously, or just because, they thought that what they were saying, needed to be said. And the authorities responded in kind.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. Now, in your previous book on the folk singers in the Bureau, you show us how the artists at that time were targeted by the FBI, often because of their association with the Communist Party and the movement more broadly. In this book, however, as you said in the intro, the old left is being replaced by the new left. Can you talk about how the left in the U.S. was shifting at the time and how the locus of repression moved from the FBI proper to other more distributed cultural and social institutions throughout society?
Yeah, it's complicated. So you've got the Soviet Union, which throughout the 30s and 40s is a huge force in the world, and it's a huge model for a lot of the left, not just in the United States, but globally. A lot of the shortcomings of the Soviet Union and some of the outrageous stuff is either being denied or just not known at that time. But it's coherent. And, in the United States, there's a Communist Party that has tens of thousands of members. They're under assault from like 1949 on, but they are formidable. There's others, there's socialists and other kind of leftists, but the Communist Party actually has a country that they point to, and in a sense, in a model of how they want to transform the United States. But that is going to fall away. In 56, there's this big crisis with Khrushchev where he denounces Stalin, and then you got China, which had only gained independence in 1949 and set down the road toward its conception of socialism, and Mao doesn't like what Khrushchev does, and this is a percolating controversy. So there's a split by the late 50s into the 60s in what had been an international communist movement, and it means that there is no single left source cohering everybody, and a lot of the stuff that Khrushchev had revealed, leads a lot of people to not want to have too much to do with the Soviet Union. Very apprehensive about China. Some people wanted to support China, but there's a moment where the old order has been overthrown. It's no longer it's no longer the U.S. versus socialism worldwide. It's the U.S. versus China, and the U.S. versus the Soviet Union, and China versus the Soviet Union. It's like a tripole contention. And so the old order is overthrown, a new order isn't put in place. And this is where the new left comes from, and it's trying to find its way in a very fractured world, which, it's both good and it also exerts some limitations and stuff. So the FBI, they're geared toward studying old line communists. Their big focus has been the Communist Party USA. So in the 60s, they're just racing to catch up, especially with, groups like the Black Panther Party. They're targeting the Nation of Islam, what they call black hate groups. They're, trying to get ahead of that amid, major urban disturbances, insurrections, rebellions, riots, whatever you want to call it. They're trying to get ahead of that. And then, at the same time, they're trying to get ahead of an anti-Vietnam War movement that is growing increasingly contentious, going from protest to resistance, So like all of these things are swirling. This founder of sociology, Emil Durkheim, has this conception of anomie, which, my simplistic definition is it's when the old rules have been put aside and new rules are not yet in place. And that's kind of how I see the 60s. It's like you got the new left, you've got the old left, you've got the counterculture, you've got Black freedom, you've got anti-war, you've got people who want revolution, you want people who want fundamental reform, and it's all just kind of up in the air. And the ruling class, they're fighting in Vietnam and they're losing, which is like huge. It's a huge historic impact. It's one thing to go to war and sacrifice. It's another thing to go to war and sacrifice and lose. So all of this stuff is getting thrown up, and it's in the music. I mean, this is part of what I came to appreciate much more deeply, that these songs, there's a reason you can't just sit down and write a song like Ohio, which is Crosby, Stills, and Nash and Young's song about the killing of students at Kent State. You can't just sit down today and write a song like that because, you need to channel the actual human experience that goes into, being able to create that. That song, David Crosby, who just passed away, he was reading Life magazine in 1970, and they had a photo spread of these kids being shot dead by the National Guard at the Kent State campus after, Nixon had made an incursion into Cambodia. The war was supposed to be ending, and it seemed like he was escalating it. And 4 kids are killed, students, college students, some on their way to classes, So Crosby's looking at this magazine spread, and he gives it to Neil Young. Neil Young goes away for a very short time, and he comes back with this single, Ohio. Dorian Lynskey, the journalist, said it's probably one of the best topical songs ever written. And I tend to, it really is a wonderful song, but it's a song paid for in blood. It's not just coming out of imagination. In any of these songs, Dylan, the times they are changing, the Doors, the End, none of these songs are just coming from the, disconnected genius of particular artists. They're coming from trying to grasp everything that's swirling in the ether and make some kind of sense of it, to have some kind of vision of it, to play the role of artists, of being able to see maybe a little bit beyond the immediate times they're in, or at least, being able to synthesize it and stuff. So that's, all this tumult, all this enemy, is leading to wonderful things that are not possible in more, for lack of a better word, ordinary times.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, the images of Kent State, even though I was born, many, many years later, still seared in my head. When you say Kent State, the image pops into my head that probably pops into most people's head of that young woman, holding a dead body, screaming, and just brutal that the American state inflicted. I mean, such incredible violence on college students. It is absolutely grotesque.
And you listen to the opening notes of that song. I remember I think I was probably 13, just hanging with my friends, and it came on the radio, AM radio. And there was just something chilling about the opening notes. I don't know if it's Neil Young or Stephen Stills playing it, but it's like, where does this musical emotiveness come from? It just really comes from very heavy stuff. So, it, garnered a much deeper appreciation in writing this book of these things.
Yeah.
could you run when you know? Soldiers and Nixon's coming, we're finally on our own. This summer I hear the drumming, for dead in Ohio, 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 howling in war, for dead in Ohio, why?
You said earlier that, the 60s were a time when the old rules were sort of dying, but the new rules or whatever were not in place, the new norms, whatever. Based on your obvious experience at that time, but more importantly, perhaps your research and study that went into a book like this, do you see today and the 2020s as also a similar time where it seems that many of the things that held through the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s and shaped our society are dying? They're being confronted from different ends, and we're sort of groping in the dark for what comes next. We're unsure. Do you think we're living in a similar time in that respect?
That's a really pointed and important question. I kind of, it sure feels that way. But I'm not going to say it is or it isn't. But it feels like I don't know what comes next. Mm-hmm. And I know things are very unsettled. Not to end up, not to get off track about what we're actually talking about, but I love actually trying to understand this. It's the United States that I grew up in is disappearing, very rapidly. This preeminent power in the world is being rattled. The internal polarization is just stunning. But, I just read this book by this Johns Hopkins professor called China's Long Game, and it talks about how China has this view of, in 2049, the 100th anniversary of the revolution, of playing a much bigger role globally. And you do kind of see that starting to play out. How that actually develops is anybody's guess, but if the world order gets realigned, there is some similarity. I can't say what the future is. I can say, though, in 1963 the world order was getting realigned. In 1962 the U.S. came the closest it ever came to nuclear war when the Soviets, attempting to get some kind of nuclear parity, put missiles in Cuba, in striking distance of Washington, D.C. And it almost came to blows. It almost came to a very bad end, and they were able to pull back from that. But, 10 years later, so, then that stopped. But then all these proxy wars happened, right? Cuba, the U.S. lost Cuba, and they weren't going to lose Vietnam. The stakes were suddenly up. So, these geopolitical shifts and maneuvering were having a profound effect. It got resolved because, China basically had rapprochement with the United States. So by 72, 73, China and the U.S. are objectively allies. So the world order has been realigned, and then you go into the last phase of the Cold War. But before that happened, when you had China, the Soviets, and the U.S. all kind of contending, and nothing was fully settled. You had a lot of things springing up. So are we in a similar situation today? Yeah, I really can't say for sure, but it does feel like things are changing, and change tends to, when it finally does hit a critical mass, it does come quickly. So we will see. Meantime, I know I'll just be plugging away trying to understand whatever it is within my purview that I can understand. So.
Yeah, it reminds me of I think it was a Kierkegaard quote that says something like, life must be lived forward but can only be understood backwards. And I think there is some time down the line where retrospection allows us to make sense of a period that when you were living in it, it was unclear which way it was going to break, and only in retrospect can you make full sense of it. So I think it probably in a similar situation, however this period of time goes, it will probably need some retrospect to fully make sense out of. But for whether it's the neoliberal era or the technocratic expertise and the legitimacy of the technocracy, or the unipolarity, the unipolar moment that we lived through in the 90s and through the aughts, all those things seem in one way or another to be coming to an end from internal and external pressures. And so it's very interesting, but also a very chaotic time, as all times of transition are.
Yeah, I think that's well stated.
Well, another aspect of this story and of the political context at the time was, of course, the civil rights movement. This involved marches, riots, protests, movement building, assassinations, bitterly violent white reaction, and it was all given expression through the music at the time. Can you talk about the intersection of the civil rights struggle and the music of the time and the reaction to it from the white mainstream culture?
Yeah, so one thing I do here is, and one thing I guess I discovered, and I think there really needs to be more. I was talking to my friend Connor, and he was like, "Hey, man, why don't you write a book about the riots of the '60s?" Which, I was looking around, and there's, academia, they always want to kind of chop things up to be so specific. So, rather than this big survey of the riot of the '60s, you'll see, urban uprisings in eastern Pennsylvania in the '60s. And then I guess from there, you're supposed to extrapolate the whole big picture. All that's by way of saying is what I can, I can't write that book as much as I, might want to. What I came to discover is, look, violence and Black liberation went hand in hand. I kind of make a point that, I'll hold that for a second. So, first off, why is the Black freedom movement happening? And I think a lot of it, nobody was ever, it was always contentious, and, Black people and their supporters were always pushing against the order, whether it had been slavery or, the abandoning Reconstruction or, the Jim Crow order. But it did seem to hit a certain moment in the late 50s. You had Brown versus the Board of Education, which unleashed, the civil rights movement, where King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference played a major role. But it is tethered to the Cold War. Here's the United States saying, we have the model. Capitalism, Western capitalism, in freedom is the model, and we stand against the Soviets and, what they call totalitarianism. And that model is bad. But yet here they had, a huge section of their people living in these, most oppressive conditions. So, the Jim Crow order, it was a matter of showing the world that the United States was better. And that order had to be dug up. And that kind of set things loose. So again, you see it tied to geopolitics. But that order, I have this quote, LBJ, the President Johnson, had this quote. I think he was talking after the Martin Luther King was killed and there was riots in nearly every major city in the U.S. Johnson said, well, somebody said, well, why is this happening? And he's like, well, if you have your foot on the neck of a man and you hold him down for 300 years and you let him up, what do you think's going to happen? He's going to knock your block off. And that is actually what happened in the 60s. I mean, the narrative is, civil rights was won through, nonviolent Gandhian peaceful resistance. But in fact, as early as I think 62, there's riots in Alabama. Riots are kind of the real thing that's going on. Even Bloody Sunday, Selma, it's violence. And the dirty secret about Gandhi and violence is it's not no violence. It's one-sided violence in which, the oppressor attacks you, and then, the whole world can see that you're righteous and they're not. I mean, that's the Gandhian model. And in fact, most people can't tolerate that. It takes an incredible amount of discipline and, yes, moral courage to be nonviolent in the face of that. But the reality is in the 60s, starting in Alabama in the early 60s, Harlem in 1964, Watts in 1965, Newark, Detroit in 67 and 68, there's these huge conflagrations, unorganized, spontaneous violence, which unseen in the United States up to then. Up to then, a race riot was white people kicking the shit out of black people. In the 60s, a race riot became, black people, sometimes kicking the shit out of white people, right or wrong, just very, just elements of rage and we're not going to be treated this way anymore. So they have a profound impact, and it does make the FBI nuts. They're trying to get informants everywhere and trying to get ahead of this. They've been watching Martin Luther King, to whatever end, but they're also watching people like Stokely Carmichael, who, later changed his name to Kwame Ture. Stokely Carmichael is part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is not nonviolent per se. They're kind of open to doing whatever, and they become increasingly radical as the period goes on. And, this whole thing of I have a dream and blacks and whites living together equally with equal respect, transitions into Black power, where Black people are saying, we want to be seen and respected, in our own and on our own right. And that has a profound way in terms of how it asserts itself in the street. That's where Hoover's counterintelligence program comes from. The best example in my book is you got this artist from South Africa, Miriam Makeba, who's just got this wonderful voice. She has a top hit with this song, Pata Pata. I hope you can put a link to this. It's just a really wonderful, life-affirming song. She marries Stokely, 68, 69, and the FBI is all over her. They got a file, hundreds of pages. They're sending people to her concerts. She's, they're leaking stuff in the media. They're saying, well, her and Stokely are rich. They're buying a house, which, it's all very exaggerated. The two of them moved to, I believe, Guinea in Africa, and kind of exit themselves. But they're like a huge target. You and I have talked in the past about, the black, Judas and the Black Messiah, that, this notion that Fred Hampton was considered a Black Messiah. It's not something I agree with. Stokely Carmichael is a named Black Messiah. In the COINTELPRO memo, Hoover says, people like King, if he becomes more radical, Stokely Carmichael, Elijah Muhammad have the potential to become Black Messiahs who could lead, Black people in very radical and dangerous directions for the U.S. So Miriam Makeba had the misfortune of falling in love and marrying Stokely, and her career took a major hit as a result. So that's where you see a, direct FBI, impacting, because, it fell into the purview of Black hate COINTELPRO and stuff. So, that's one example. Sam Cooke, I asked for his, the pop singer Sam Cooke wrote these great songs like Cupid and Another Saturday Night. And he also writes this huge anthem, A Change Is Gonna Come. He has an FBI file, but they say they destroyed it. So I don't quite know what they had to say on him. It could just be it was so short that, they were legally enabled to get rid of it. But, he was not somebody who fit into the model. So, he's another one. Richie Havens, the folk singer who opens Woodstock singing Freedom, he has a file too, another one that's been destroyed. So I don't quite know what the deal there was. But, so that's some of the intersection of how the FBI took this on. And, in the larger society, there's there's huge contention. There's a lot of support for this. And then there's people like George Wallace, who runs for president in 68, basically, upholding the Jim Crow integration, separate but equal order and stuff. So it's a lot of back and forth in that period, bringing us to where we are now, which is, not a land of great peace and harmony, but still a lot of contention back and forth.
Yeah. I mean, the 2020 uprisings, Black Lives Matter uprisings, the biggest in American history. I mean, a lot of these problems, they never get solved. They erupt at certain times. The LA riots was another example of this eruption when things come to a boiling point. But because America refuses to address its deep racial issues at the systemic level, these things are going to continue to occur. We're living in these loops over and over again because, the society as a whole and the state in particular refuses to do anything to acknowledge and, repair the damage done from, hundreds of years of white supremacy. And so I think it's going to take more struggles and a sort of overall radical change in society that opens up the possibility for us to try to address at the material level these historical injustices if we're ever going to, as a society, escape it. But that also might actually not be able to be done within the confines of the society. It might, if it's really done in a real way, it might be akin to a sort of revolutionary rupture from the American society that is plagued by these problems, but that remains to be seen, just that these issues are a live issue. And just to throw in a little localism, I'm obviously born and raised here in Omaha, and I worked with an older white lady at one point who was alive during the Martin Luther King assassination. She was in high school, and Omaha had its own riot after the assassination of MLK, and she remembers that the black students in her high school got up when they heard the news, left, and immediately went out to join the broader riots. We had a pretty active Black Panther Party chapter here in Omaha as well. Of course, Malcolm X and Harry Haywood, they were born here in Omaha. Harry Haywood is just a few miles from where I grew up in South Omaha. So, I just wanted to throw that in there. Omaha has its hand in this as well, and obviously Omaha also showed up for the Black Lives Matter protest pretty rigorously as well. So this is something that occurs across the entire society and will continue to occur.
That's fascinating. I just wanted to insert because one of the things I did come to in this book is, look, in the United States, the narrative of civil rights is, King did the Montgomery bus boycott. They did the March on Washington in 1963, and then the Voting Rights Act was passed, and that was the end of the story. And I think some of what I've talked about is well, that's actually not quite how it went. The quote that comes to mind is H. Rap Brown. He's a Muslim now. Unfortunately, I don't know his Muslim name off the top of my head, but he had this famous quote, violence is as American as cherry pie, which, that's the real thing. You can name as many boulevards Martin Luther King Boulevard as you want, but if you're not, like you say, unearthing the systemic oppression, you're still going to confront people not wanting to be treated, as less than human, as less than fully realized as everyone else. So.
Alabama's got me so upset. Tennessee made me lose my rest. Everybody knows about Mississippi, goddamn. Alabama's got me so upset. Lurleen Wallace has made me lose my rest. Everybody knows about Mississippi, goddamn. Can't you see it? I know you can feel it. It's all in the air. I can't stand the pressure much longer. Somebody say a prayer. Alabama has got me so upset, and Memphis has made me lose my rest. Everybody knows about Mississippi, goddamn. Hound dogs on my trail. Little school children sitting in jail. Black cat crossed my path. I think every day's gonna be my last. Lord, have mercy on this land of mine. We all gonna get it in due time. Cause I don't belong here, I don't belong there. I've even stopped believing in prayer. Don't tell me, I'll tell you. Me and my people just about to. I've been there, so I know. We keep on saying go slow. Well, that's just the trouble. Washing the windows, picking the cotton, nothing but rotten, too damn lazy, thinking's crazy. Where am I going? What am I doing? I don't know. Just try to do my very best. Stand up, be counted with all the rest. Cause everybody knows about Mississippi. Goddamn! Now you heard him. He's one of you. If you have been moved at all, and you know my songs at all, for God's sakes, join me. Don't sit back there. The time is too late now. Good God. You know, the king is dead. The king of love is dead. I ain't about to be nonviolent, honey. Oh, no. Picket lines, school boycotts. They try to say it's a communist plot, but all I want is equality for my sister, my brother, my people, and me. And I loved him because he believed it. He lived by it. But you lied to me all these years. You told me to wash and clean my ears and talk real fine, just like a lady. And you stopped calling my mama Aunt Sadie. Hear me now. But my country is full of lies. We all gonna die and die like flies. I don't trust nobody anymore. Keep on saying go slow. That's just the trouble. Too slow. Desegregation. Too slow. Mass participation. Too slow. Unification. Too slow. Do things gradually. Too slow. More tragedy. Why don't you see it? Why don't you feel it? I don't know. You don't have to live next to me. Just give me my equality. Cause everybody knows about Mississippi. Everybody knows about Alabama. Everybody knows about Mississippi.
So we mentioned this a few times, and we have to go into it because it's crucial. The Cuban Revolution, and then all the stuff that came after, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs, etc., and the Vietnam War, were rocking American life and consciousness at this time. And of course, like everything else, this is filtered up through the artistic and cultural expressions of American society at that time, and through music in particular. So can you kind of talk about the Cuban situation and the Vietnam situation, and how that manifested in the form of cultural products and musical products at that time?
Yeah, so I got the FBI file of Susie Rotolo. I think I'm mangling the pronunciation. Somebody had pointed this out, but I would call her Susie Rotolo. She was Bob Dylan's first girlfriend when he came to New York in '63. She's like 17, Dylan's 19. I mean, they're just kids. Her parents had been Communist Party activists. She had worked with the Communist Party youth group, and she had gone to Cuba with the Progressive Labor Party contingent. I don't think she was part of Progressive Labor Party, but to get into Cuba, you had to be attached to something. So she's got this whole file. They're all over her. But then, sure enough, they mention that she's Bob Dylan's girlfriend, and she can be seen on the cover of Freewheelin', of Dylan and Susie arm in arm walking down a street in the West Village. And they talk about Dylan being a folk singer and stuff. So it's just all very trippy. So, I mean, the reason her file goes on is she comes back from Cuba and she's talking about the Kennedy travel ban and, opposing that and stuff. She's actually in the newspaper. Dylan, for his part, I mean, he's a character. He at this point, he's like, he's hanging around with all these leftists. So there's Susie, Gordon Friesen and Sis Cunningham do this newsletter called Broadside, where they're publishing, songs by Phil Ochs and Bob Dylan. They had been in the Communist Party, the Almanac Singer folk group back in the day. Dylan is sleeping on the couch of Terry Thal and Dave Van Ronk, who were Trotskyists at the time. Dave Van Ronk says, I was always trying to recruit Bob Dylan, but I don't think he really gave a shit about the true nature of the Soviet Union. So all this is having a profound effect on Dylan, who's writing his most political work. I mean, he only stays with that for a year or two before he transitions, to more experimental stuff. But it is, you see it kind of caught up in the swirl with what's going on in the Caribbean, and then you got Phil Ochs, right, who kind of underappreciated, maybe even underrated. Phil Ochs, he writes this song in 65 called Santo Domingo. So, the U.S. loses Cuba. I mean, I don't know, what all happened. I mean, one minute Castro is on Ed Sullivan, and next minute, Castro is inviting the Soviets to do missiles. Mm-hmm. The U.S. loses Cuba, and they're not going to lose anything else. So when there is a coup in Santo Domingo, and it looks like, the communists might be leveraging that to come to power, the U.S. sends the Marines in. And then Phil Ochs writes this song called Santo Domingo, and he talks about the crabs are crawling, on the beaches because the Marines have landed on the shores of Santo Domingo. So you see this intersection of what's going on in the Caribbean. Your question about Cuba, the Dominican Republic and Cuba are very close, in many ways. And the U.S. is not going to lose the Dominican Republic, and by extension, they're not going to lose Vietnam. The Indonesia, the CIA helps mastermind a bloody coup to eliminate the Communist Party as a force there. So you've got the U.S. globally throwing down, we may have lost Cuba, but we're not losing any more ground. But it's impacting, culturally, from Susie Rotola's connection to Dylan, which is kind of maybe more tangential to, more overtly, Phil Ochs.
There's been a drastic change in American foreign policy in recent months. Take the Dominican Republic, which we did a little while ago, killing a few people here and there, mostly there, saving the day for freedom and democracy in the Western Hemisphere once again, folks. I was over there in the Dominican Republic entertaining the troops. I won't say which troops. Over there with a USO group, including Walter Lippmann and Soupy Sells. I played there in a small coffee house called The Sniper. And this was my most unpopular song, with the poetic, symbolic title of "The Marines Have Landed on the Shores of Santo Domingo." And the crabs are crazy, they scuttle back and forth, the sand is burning, and the fish take flight and scatter from the side, their course is turning. As the seagulls rest on the cold cannon nest, the sea is churning. The Marines have landed on the shores of Santo Domingo. The fishermen sweat, they're pausing at their nets, the days are burning. As the warships sway and thunder in the bay loud in the morning. But the boy on the shore's throwing pebbles no more, he runs a warning that the Marines have landed on the shores of Santo Domingo. The streets are still, there's silence in the hills, the town is sleeping, and the farmers yawn in the gray silver dawn, the fields they're keeping. As the first troops land and step into the sand, the flags are weeping. The Marines have landed on the shores of Santo Domingo. The unsmiling sun is shining down upon the singing soldiers. In the cloud dust world, they whistle at the girls, they're getting bolder. Ah, the old women sigh, think of memories gone by, they shrug their shoulders. The Marines have landed on the shores of Santo Domingo. Ready for the tricks, their bayonets are fixed, now they are rolling. And the tanks make tracks past the trembling shacks where fear's unfolding. All the young wives afraid turn their backs to the parade with babes they're holding. The Marines have landed on the shores of Santo Domingo. A bullet cracks the sound, the army hits the ground, the sniper's calling. So they open up their guns, 1,000 to 1, no sense in stalling. He clutches at his head and totters on the edge, look now he's falling. The Marines have landed on the shores of Santo Domingo. In the Red Plaza Square, the crowds come to stare, the heat is leaning, and the eyes of the dead are turning every head to the widow screaming. But the soldiers make a bid, giving candy to the kids, their teeth are gleaming. The Marines have landed on the shores of Santo Domingo. Up and down the coast, the generals drink a toast, the wheel is spinning, and the cowards and the whores are peeking through the doors to see who's winning. But the traitors will pretend that it's getting near the end when it's beginning. The Marines have landed on the shores of Santo Domingo. And the crabs are crazy, they scuttle back and forth, the sand is burning, and the fish take flight and scatter from the side, their course is turning. As the seagulls rest on the cold cannon nest, the sea is churning. The Marines have landed on the shores of Santo Domingo.
And then Kennedy gets assassinated, and that creates all kinds of so I got to tell the Kennedy story,
Sure,
right? Because
yeah.
Kennedy gets killed, and Dylan, 2 weeks later, he's getting the Tom Paine Award from the Emergency Civil Liberties Committee, which is kind of associated with the Communist Party. So he's up there with James Baldwin and some of these old CP members, and Dylan's getting a little high on alcohol. So, he gets up, he gives a whole rambling speech about, well, I'm a young person and you guys aren't young, and, blah, blah, blah. And he talks about Cuba, and he says, I don't think there's anything wrong with going to Cuba, which you would think that would have been the most controversial thing. But then he says, I can kind of understand Lee Harvey Oswald. I wouldn't have done stuff like that, but I see a little bit of him in me. So it's something like that. I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah.
But there's informants in the room, and like Dylan's whole shtick ends up in a column by Fulton Lewis Jr., who is a friend of J. Edgar Hoover's. So it's in a national column, and the FBI opens a file on Dylan based on this. I mean, in the public sphere, Dylan tries to walk it back a little bit. Look, it's just Dylan, like any other person, kind of processing stuff and thinking openly, probably saying the quiet part out loud.
Sure.
I mean, who cares, what Dylan thinks about Oswald? But, in this country, they talk about freedom of speech, except when you go there, then it's not free. But so this is a huge deal with Dylan, and it's part of what I talk about in the book, of a number of things aimed at Dylan back in this period. Dylan was not somebody who was welcome by a certain section of U.S. society, and this is a very stark example of that. But that's all tied up with the Cuba stuff too. Cuba is a huge problem in the U.S., and where you fall out on it is of extreme consequence.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I'm going to be putting songs in that you mention in this episode as we go through it, to give people a sort of a taste of what you're talking about and how the music hits in regards to the issues that the songs are covering. But yeah, that's just incredibly important. And there's so much music that just comes out of the Vietnam conflict in and of itself. That is, absolutely classic Americana music. And it was, the impetus was the Vietnam War and the reaction to it. But another critical component of the 60s in particular was the rise of drug use, especially psychedelics like mushrooms, LSD, peyote, etc. And this was inseparable from the artistic and musical movements of the era as well. As a teenager myself, first experimenting with magic mushrooms in particular, I actually became pretty obsessed with the Doors in my junior year of high school, in large part because of certain intense experience I had tripping on mushrooms while listening to their music. I remember in my junior year of high school, I went to a high school where the football team and the guys at the high school did not like me from previous instances when I was at a different high school, and some girls were involved, and they felt like they owned the girls at their school, and when they would date guys in other schools, it was a whole problem, right? So that was kind of the thing. So I had to go to this school where I was hated by all the guys, and I would, often get in fights, but it would often also mean that I didn't have anywhere to sit at lunch. And I remember wearing the Doors t-shirts and going back to the back of the school where nobody could really see me in the hallways and reading a biography of the Doors. It's just very nostalgic for me in that period of my time, because I was experimenting for the first time with these psychedelics, listening to the Doors, and then I had all this other stuff going on in my life, and it was kind of a refuge for me in the heated moments of my junior year in high school in particular. So that's just a little digression on my personal life experiences, but I'm somebody going to high school in the aughts, right? Somebody very disconnected by decades from the actual Doors and their run in the culture. So with all of that in mind, can you kind of talk about these drugs, the fear and reaction to it, the drug war, and sort of its impact on culture and music?
Yeah, well, just before I do that, Ray Manzarek's book, about the Doors. He really hates Oliver Stone's film. And you read his book and you realize the Doors are really, most of these artists are really, the matter of which side are you on is really key here. Look, the Carpenters were on that side. The Lettermen were on that side. And if you were on that side, you weren't on this side. And the Doors and the Animals and Jefferson Airplane and Your Service, they were all on this side. Even the Rascals are on, the side of kind of the youthful, rebellious tumult. So things are, very polarized that way. And the better music is coming from, for lack of a better word, the left side. So having said that, Breht, I feel like I just lost your question. Can you repeat that a little?
Yeah, it was just an open-ended big question about the impact of psychedelic drugs and the drug war.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so LSD is legal, right? But then people start doing it, and by 66, they're making it illegal on the state level, and eventually the feds get in. But, Lennon did a lot of LSD, and, the music transformed. It was like, suddenly you're kicking down all the walls, and instead of standing in a room, you're standing in a field with a huge sky above you, and everything is limitless. I'm not extolling this stuff in an untethered way, but to go from the kind of conformity of Mad Men circa 61, 62 to everything is possible, question everything. I mean, I think some of these drugs had that impact for whatever social, psychological, biological reason. It allowed people to look beyond, to what's the word, to smash through the paradigm, that revolution in science theory, to be able to actually construct something else. A lot of the Beatles' best, most experimental stuff came out of Lennon's, experimenting with LSD. Look, this stuff's got limits. I did some of that stuff too. I went and saw Leonard Skinner in the middle 70s. I was really looking forward to it. Ronnie Van Zant was still alive, and I was tripping. And Ronnie Van Zant looked like a little pig. It was very disappointing. And they did Freebird, right? And the intro to Freebird just went on I think it was about 3.5 hours that intro went on before they did the jam, So that was kind of my last time I did psychedelics. I think I need to be a little more grounded. But, look, it had an effect of, let's look at things qualitatively differently. I mean, I don't know you always need to do drugs to do that. But sometimes, it helps to have a little push. And if you look at the music, it's really a trip. I mean, Jefferson Airplane, right? Couple stories about Jefferson Airplane, who are one of my favorites, and I think underappreciated, in the period circa 67 to 70, they're really doing some really overtly radical music and very experimental. I mean, they're put forward as the quintessence of psychedelia. Paul Kantner, the leader of the group, and was a huge fan of the Weavers from the 1950s, this folk group. And, so, they kind of come up with a kind of a folk sensibility. Somebody told me a story that Paul Kantner knew Ronnie Gilbert, who was the woman singer in the Weavers, and Ronnie told him, Paul, you want to have a good group, you need a woman in the group. And, Jefferson Airplane, what set them apart is they have this powerful woman, Grace Slick, at the center. I mean, without her, the group is just good, but with Grace Slick, they're just powerful. Very few groups having men and women. I mean, actually, I cringe a little when I think of all these aging classic rock stars. It's 4 or 5, swinging dicks, right? It's all guys. They're good, but geez, come on, man. There's more than that to humanity. Anyway, so, but airplane is psychedelic, but they're grounded in folk music. And there's this leap up, and how did they do that? Well, I think the drugs maybe were a little bit of a catalyst. So, but, kids, take it easy, be responsible.
Definitely.
You don't want to go to a concert and see your favorite person be a little pig man.
I totally agree with you that these things are interesting, but they definitely have their limits. And I've known some people personally, and we've seen people historically who, especially at that time, would overdo it and really basically, in sort of for lack of a better term, fry their brains. It's like you can get something out of it. I remember Ram Dass, who was obviously very active in the 60s. He used to be a Harvard professor doing psychedelic research at Harvard and was kicked out of Harvard because of it, and then went to India and got involved in Hinduism and Buddhism and came back as Ram Dass. And he talks about psychedelics, and this is somebody who would do it every day for years of his life, apparently. And he's like, with psychedelics, when you get the message, hang up the phone. It's like, it's limited in what it can show you. It can show you amazing things the first few times you try it, but to make it a thing where you're doing it all the time, you're not getting anything new. You're degrading your capacity to actually be tethered to reality, and people really kind of lose their minds by going too deep into these rabbit holes. And I always like that quote of, when you get the message, hang up the phone. And I felt like it's true if anybody's going to experiment with this stuff, to kind of take it easy, understand the limitations of what these things can do. And if you really want the spiritual revelations that things like psychedelics are lauded for making possible, I would much prefer people take the perhaps less intense road of spiritual practice and meditation, stuff like that, because you are kind of playing with fire when it comes to these psychedelics. But culturally, having these things influx into society, what they do is they sort of break down the ego on an individual level and all the conventions that come with it, the defense mechanisms that are a part of it. They create radical openings, rewiring of your neural connections, such that new things become available for the first time. And so I could see why even just that the music and the psychedelics and their mix is threatening to a 50s and 60s American culture that in many areas and conservative areas is very conformist, very much not about doing any of these things. And you could see why it sort of scared society to see, the influx of these chemicals in particular, but also the cultural fallout that surrounded them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like putting on X-ray goggles, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, I wanted to do something fun here because we're talking about the underpinning social, political, economic issues and how they're translated in the music. And you cover so many amazing artists and bands. I couldn't get to them all. So I wanted to set a little section aside where we could cover some of the major artists in more or less a lightning round fashion. So I'll throw out a couple names that we haven't talked about so far, and you can kind of briefly riff on who they were, what their impact was, and how they fit into the story. And the first, cool. The first person I'll throw at you, and we've done a whole episode on her if anybody's interested. She's really a fascinating figure, but Nina Simone.
Yeah, angry woman, but she writes this song, Mississippi Goddamn, and it's genius. She does it as kind of a show tune, and it's just railing against the white supremacist order. And she has this line. There's different versions, but the version I really embrace is the one where she's basically talking to these white supremacists and says, "You're all gonna die and die like flies." That's Nina.
Yeah, she was an absolute badass. What was that one song? The Backlash Blues. I always loved that song as well, and that was very much in the ferment of the Vietnam War and the decolonization movements around the world, the Black liberation struggles in and outside of the U.S., and that song just absolutely still hits today. All right, the next one I have for you, Aaron, is Johnny Cash, a personal favorite of mine.
Yeah, funny guy, man. He's like 1 foot in America and 1 foot somewhere else, but he thinks he's Native American. A lot of people do, in this country. I mean, there's a basis for that. He's actually not, but he does a whole album of, homage to Native people, including his famous song, the Ballad of Ira Hayes. And the record company says, okay, you can make it. We're not going to sell it. And Cash basically says, well, fuck you. I'm going to sell it. And he sends it out, takes it around personally to radio stations and with a basic challenge, do you have the guts to play this? And, he makes it a hit. So Johnny Cash, you want as a friend.
Yeah.
Because if you're his friend, he's going to stand by you. And if you're his enemy, watch out.
Definitely. His song Man in Black always jumps out to me as talking about the poor, the dispossessed, why he wears all black for the people that are, destroyed by this society. And Folsom Prison Blues, his forays into performing inside of prisons and having that sort of sympathy for those, elements of American society that were utterly discarded.
Yeah, that song, my brother, he's passed on, but my brother introduced me to Johnny Cash, and he played the song Folsom Prison, and he said, now listen to this when he said, I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die, and the crowd goes nuts. All right, yeah.
Yeah. I think Johnny Cash has this really interesting place in American society, even to this day, where I live in a deep red state here in Nebraska, and I've lived in Iowa and Montana as well. And he's loved universally by those on the political right, but he's also loved universally by, my comrades and those on the political left as well. And he's one of the few figures that is very well loved in general from people all across the political spectrum, and I always found that a kind of interesting thing about him and his impact. All right. You want to go into the next one? The next one is interesting. The next one is Buffy St. Marie.
Yeah, she's a Native woman, one of the very, very few. She does this song, Universal Soldier, which is an anti-war song that the Scottish artist Donovan has a hit with. She reports, LBJ was all up in her business, basically writing to radio stations saying, don't play this, so she, there's evidence that her career was suppressed as a result. She's still around. I just put a thing up on, I have a Facebook page if your listeners want to follow me. And I'm also on Twitter, but I just posted a picture of her singing at Alcatraz Island when it was occupied by the American Indian movement. I think it was around 69 or so. And it's just a beautiful picture. And she's just a wonderful artist.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know about that part of it, but I do. I think I was introduced to her from her rendition of "Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee," which was a very impactful and a sort of beautiful song. So she was basically a Native American activist and musician, correct?
Exactly. She comes up out of Canada.
Nice.
The Canadians really embraced their artists, Buffy St. Marie and Gordon Lightfoot, and of course Neil Young and Joni Mitchell. They've actually given us a lot. They've given us some really precious people.
Yeah. All right, last one I have for you, and this is one I actually came into contact with only very recently, but he makes pretty intense songs, pretty funny ones. Dave Von Ronk. You want to talk about him?
Yeah, he's a folk singer, coming out of the early 60s. And, he was invited to be part of Peter, Paul, and Mary, but he turned it down. And so instead they took this guy, Noel Paul Stuckey, took his place. But had Van Ronk joined that trio, it was a self-created thing by Bob Dylan's manager, Albert Grossman. But, Van Ronk was a longtime Trotskyist, huge FBI file. They were all in his business all the time. There's a funny story that... So his FBI file says it has a report of him reporting for his physical to get inducted to Vietnam. And they basically said, oh, the guy was sweaty. He was nervous. I think he's got mental problems, So basically he was given a classification as undesirable. His ex-wife, Terry Thal, told me that the deal was the night before the physical, him and his buddy went out, got drunk and high and totally fucked up. So they would be in a wretched state for the physical. And then, Van Ronk was just really overplaying. Oh, I'm nervous. I'm crazy. It's kind of like the Arlo Guthrie Ellis's restaurant model, writ large, but very successful. Kind of fooled the FBI, who considered him unstable, afterwards. And he was not. I'm sure he had his own issues, but the issues they thought he had were not the issues he had. But dude was a very important mentor of Bob Dylan. People live in a community, and none of these artists are, single bright stars on their own. So Van Ronk and Thal, you got to give it to nurturing Dylan at a point when he needed it.
When I came back from Luang Prabang, I didn't have a thing where my balls used to hang, but I had a wooden medal and a fine harangue. Now I'm a fucking hero. Mourn your dead, land of the free. If you want to be a hero, follow me. Mourn your dead, land of the free. If you want to be a hero, follow me. And how the boys all envy me. I fought for Christian democracy with nothing but air where my balls used to be. Now I'm a fucking hero. Mourn your dead, land of the free. If you want to be a hero, follow me. Mourn your dead, land of the free. If you want to be a hero, follow me. Like 1 in 20 cannon thunder into the bloody wild blue yonder for a patriotic ballless wonder. Now I'm a fucking hero. Mourn your dead, land of the free. If you want to be a hero, follow me. Mourn your dead, land of the free. If you want to be a hero, follow me. In Luang Prabang there is a spot where the corpses of your brothers rot, and every corpse is a patriot. Every corpse is a hero. Mourn your dead, land of the free. If you want to be a hero, follow me. Mourn your dead, land of the free. If you want to be a hero, follow me.
Dylan's one of my favorites, so it's kind of part of where I'm coming from on that, for all his ups and downs and craziness.
Yeah, do you want to say anything else about Bob Dylan? Because I know we mentioned him throughout this episode, but since he's a big figure in your mind, you want to talk a little bit more about him?
Yeah, just that. So he does all this great political music that really stands up, but then he, 65, 66, he produces this genius work, Bringing It All Back Home album, Highway 61 Revisited, and Blonde on Blonde. And that's part of, going back to the the effects of drugs or just this whole kind of paradigm smashing outlook. These albums and this music is radical without being political, politically radical. It's just it's a fusing of the beat aesthetic, elements of jazz, folk music, rock, all melded into one. And you can still pick it up and listen to it today. And almost every time you listen, you can kind of derive a different pleasure. So, he was kind of castigated by more doctrinaire left forces at the time for leaving topical music. But in those 2 or 3 years, I mean, he just produced lasting work. And, part of why we still care about Dylan. And he's a funny guy who's, later in life has been able to, from time to time, produce, really interesting stuff. But nothing, I'm sorry, on the level of what he was able to do in those years. I mean, the poetry was coming from almost a mystical place. And I'm not a mystical person, but
sure.
It is kind of how it comes through.
Yeah, I know Masters of War, still absolutely bone-chilling to hear that song. Oh, I can listen to it a million times, and it's still incredibly moving, and just the anger and the righteousness that it can generate, inside me at least, is powerful.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I've just been queuing up When the Ship Comes In, which he sang at the March on Washington. So Martin Luther King is talking about I Have a Dream, and Dylan's going all Old Testament, saying, the Pharaoh's tribe will be drowned in the tide, and like Goliath, they'll be conquered. I mean, it was, very stark imagery of essentially Black people getting free and doing away with their oppressors.
Yeah. One more point, actually going back to, it's Bob Dylan and Dave Von Ronk. I don't know if you know the movie by the Coen brothers, Inside Llewyn Davis, but it's a great movie. Yeah. And I think, isn't that character based off Dave Von Ronk?
It is.
Okay.
It is. Terry Thal, his ex, actually wrote an interesting piece in the Village Voice. She actually took issue with it, but it's loosely based on him. I mean, I saw this interview with the Coen brothers, and it kind of disturbed me because somebody said, well, did you want to do a parody of folk music? And they said something like, oh, you can't parody folk music. It already parodies itself. And I'm like, I don't think they quite get it. There's bad folk music, sure is. But a lot of it was really pushing the boundaries at the time. And, I guess I see the film a bit differently than you. I felt like it kind of... those times were much more uplifting if they were still a bit disorienting. But, I just kind of walked out of the film really a little rattled, like, what are they trying to say? But, maybe I missed something.
Yeah, or maybe I did. I'm not as well informed and don't have the personal experience of living through that period of time. I just like the Coen brothers, and I like that movie a lot. So I don't know if anybody's interested, you can definitely check it out. I mean, I think it has a 92 on Rotten Tomatoes, so it's a good film regardless of how you personally walk away from it feeling. But yeah, worth.
Yeah,
thoughts.
and I do have a story in the book because in the film he can't find his Merchant Marine papers, but in reality, his Merchant Marine papers are stolen, and he doesn't want to get them renewed because of his left-wing ties. He's worried it's going to be a whole deal. And sure enough, in the book, I document how the FBI and naval intelligence were conspiring to make sure he didn't get his papers replaced. So it's basically, here's where reality is even more interesting than fiction.
Yeah, interesting. All right, well, I have one more question for you, Aaron, which is just kind of conclude this wonderful conversation on this wonderful book. How is American culture today shaped by what happened from 1955 through 1972, the events that you cover in your book, and kind of what's the ultimate legacy of that period of time, in your opinion?
Yeah, I don't know that I can really answer that. I can say that it just amazes me that people are still discovering people like the Beatles and Dylan. And, I'm kind of jealous. I would love to just discover the Beatles today because there's just so much there. So I think that element, or Joni Mitchell for that matter, there's a certain canon from back then that really does hold up. And I think it's, it's obviously it's impacted things in a multitude of ways of which I can't really readily identify. But I mean, one thing is before then, you had to be a professional songwriter to write a song, and they basically changed that rule so people can write their own songs now. Although in the pop mainstream, that's kind of reverted back to, companies, hire multiple people to write music, and hits are generated almost, scientifically and stuff. But I think it's a lot of it is what's possible has become a lot more possible. The boundaries are down, and people can write and sing what they want. Some of the styles have morphed up, and been passed along. But I think it's a work in progress. There's contention still. Like I said, the pop mainstream has really reverted back, and it's hard. All the good stuff is there. You just have to go looking for it more. Mm-hmm. But to the degree you can find it, I think you do owe a debt to those folks back there. Much in the way that when I was coming up, I owed a debt to my forebears, as it were, that I didn't quite acknowledge at the time. Yeah, they gave us a lot of bad stuff too, but you got to be dialectical about these things.
Absolutely. Well said, and a perfect way to end the episode. So the book is called Whole World in an Uproar, Music, Rebellion, and Repression, 1955 through 1972. Thank you so much, Aaron, for coming on. It's always a pleasure to have you on. Always fun to talk with you. You're welcome back anytime. Before I let you go, though, is there anywhere that our listeners can find you online? I think you said your Twitter and your Facebook, which I'll link to, and also let people know where they can find the book.
Yeah, so I'm Twitter, LEONAA01. That's at LEONAA01. And you'll put my website, it's aaronleonard.net. So those are the best ways to find me.
All right, my friend. Thank you so much for coming on. Let's do it again sometime.
Okay, thanks for having me, Breht. You take care now.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody's wrong. Young people speaking their minds are getting so much resistance from behind. Time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. What a field day for the heat. 1,000 people in the street, singing songs and carrying signs, mostly say hooray for our side. It's time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. Strikes deep into your life, it will creep. It starts when you're always afraid. Step out of line, the man come and take you away. We better stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. Stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. We better stop.